In Rachel's mind, this is a bitter battle of the sisters. How sad that these sons have to bear the name of this sordid and ungodly contention, not the slightest hint of protest from Jacob. Incredible to think, this is the man God chose to be the father of his chosen people. Leah engages heartily in this sisterhood death match of hate, boasting in her child numbers in mocking tone. But even in this joyful name, the happiness is derived not from the birth of a surrogate son, but from besting her younger sister. Everything in Jacob's life is about a struggle for supremacy, getting one over your rival. If only she and her sister and Jacob had all trusted in the providence of the Lord. Christ, the ultimate son of prophecy, is the son of the right hand of the power of God. He came to die to bring us new life. Jesus, the Saviour of mankind, is the ultimate purpose for the nation Israel. Genesis 30 verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" God doesn't comment on the previous chapter about the wrongs of polygamy. The festering fruit of that sin simply reveals itself in this chapter. Envy, bitterness, strife, trouble, arousal to irrational anger. In that day, for a woman not to bear children for her husband was considered a great shame and failure. Sarah was barren, Rebekah was barren, and now Rachel is barren. All three wives of the patriarchs were barren, and had to call upon the Lord and wait upon the Lord for his miraculous intervention. Verse 3. So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Another way to render "have children by her" is to be built up by her. In Rachel's mind, this is a bitter battle of the sisters. Everyone knows Jacob served 14 years for me, and he would never have served even a day for Leah. Verse 4. Then she gave him Bilhah, meaning trouble or calamity, her maid as wife, and Jacob went into her. Worldly Jacob doesn't hesitate for a second when given the green light by Rachel for a new sexual partner. He says yes to pleasure, and more calamity will surely enter his family. Verse 5. And Bilhah conceived, and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice, and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. This is really a very sad situation. To call your son judge, in effect, God has ruled in my favour, the presumption is both sad and shocking. Verse 7. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. How sad that these sons have to bear the name of this sordid and ungodly contention. It's borderline child abuse. Verse 9. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her to Jacob as wife. Once again, not the slightest hint of protest from Jacob. He gleefully complies. 4 women to bed with his wife's approval. Incredible to think, this is the man God chose to be the father of his chosen people. Verse 10. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "A troop comes." So she called his name Gad, or fortune. Leah engages heartily in this sisterhood death match of hate, boasting in her child numbers in mocking tone. "An entire troop comes from me, as opposed to the tiny 2 from Rachel." Verse 12. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed." So she called his name Asher, or happy. But even in this joyful name, the happiness is derived not from the birth of a surrogate son, but from besting her younger sister. Verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them in to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." Even Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, is now likely a teenager and is drawn into this terrible maternal fight. It's very ugly. Everything in Jacob's life is about a struggle for supremacy, getting one over your rival. This is what Jacob has taught his family by his actions. Verse 16. When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. Rachel has clearly asserted her dominance of husbandly affection over her sister. But once again, nothing to do with love, Leah purchases the services of Jacob for the mandrakes, and nothing to do with love, Jacob happily complies and goes into Leah that night. Now I don't for a second believe the mandrakes had any actual fertility benefit. This was a totally carnal family, trusting in their own works and intellect, not relying on the providence of God. Verse 17, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived, and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar, or wages. At least in verse 17, we get some passing commentary that Leah had been praying to Yahweh. Yes, she was trading her son's mandrakes, but in between her carnal manoeuvrings, she'd also prayed to God, and calls her fifth son wages. She'd certainly earned him. Verse 19, then Leah conceived again, and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun, or dwelling. Some hope returns to Leah for love from her husband. She knows Jacob's a carnal, transactional man. Maybe he'll dwell the occasional night at my house. Now I've given him 6 sons, 8 including my maids. Verse 21. Afterward she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah. And confirming Jacob did dwell with her, at least occasionally. This is Jacob's only named daughter, called Judgment, the feminine of Dan. That he had other unnamed daughters is evident in Scripture. See Genesis 37:35. Verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. This has nothing to do with the mandrakes. This was the remembrance of God. Despite all her plotting and scheming, unrevealed in the story plot until now, Rachel had also prayed and called out to Yahweh for his intervention. And God miraculously answered Rachel's prayer. If only she and her sister and Jacob had all trusted in the providence of the Lord. Verse 23. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, "God has taken away my reproach." God has lifted her shame of childlessness. You can feel the burden of failure lifted off her life. Verse 24. So she called his name Joseph, meaning increaser, or he will add, and said, "The Lord shall add to me another son." It's very intriguing. In her moment of personal carnal victory, she prophetically utters. She's given spiritual insight into the future. And Joseph himself would ultimately become a prophet, the one son of Jacob who God clearly revealed the future to. Jacob, through the 4 women, would ultimately have 12 sons, Benjamin his last son. They would go on to become the 12 tribes of Israel. There are multiple variant listings of the 12 tribes of Israel throughout the Bible. The key to understanding these 12 tribes, there are 14 names that make up the 12 tribes. And depending on the circumstances, names are interchanged, but the number is always 12. Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph receives the paternal blessing of the firstborn. In other words, Joseph received a double land portion of inheritance. This is how we end up with 14 names, but only 12 tribes. Reuben would ultimately lose his position as firstborn due to his disgraceful affair with Bilhah, his father's concubine. The honours normally bestowed upon the firstborn is divided between 3 brothers. The priestly oversight is taken by Levi, meaning Levi received a very limited land allotment in Canaan. The patriarchal leadership is bestowed upon Judah, ultimately becoming the last son standing. And the double portion of inheritance, as I've already said, is given to the increaser, Joseph. It's worth noting the 2 major institutions of Israel, the priesthood and the kingship, come from the unloved and unwanted line of Leah. God will often take the unloved, unfashionable, the down and out, to be elevated to privileged positions. God chooses the foolish and weak things to shame the wise and mighty. Some have also pointed out the order of birth of the sons correlates with the history of Israel. Reuben, son of vision, the nation begins. Simeon, God hears the cry of Israel in Egypt. Levi, Israel joined together as a nation under oppression in Egypt. Judah, Israel praised the Lord at their Egyptian exodus. Leah's first 4 sons speak of Israel becoming a nation in Egypt. Bilhah's 2 sons speak of Israel's wilderness wanderings. Dan, judgment. God gave them Moses to judge them, and the law at Sinai for Israel to be judged by. Naphtali, wrestling, speaks of their 40 years of struggle in the wilderness. Zilpah's 2 boys speak of Israel's Canaan conquest. Gad, meaning a troop, who would conquer a fortune in rich land. And Asher, happiness, finally came to Israel once they occupied the promised land. Then Leah's final 2 sons, Issachar, Israel finally earned their own wages in the land, and Zebulun, Israel at last have a dwelling place. Dinah, Jacob's only named daughter, meaning judge, and Israel had over 300 years, called the time of the judges. Then we come to Rachel's 2 sons. First Joseph, the greatly loved son, the one whose name means increaser. After the time of the judges, David was God's chosen king for Israel, a man after God's own heart. David and his son Solomon greatly increased the dominion of Israel. Israel reached the zenith of its power under Solomon's rule, which was an extension of David's rule. But with the arrival of David came the Davidic promise, the promise of another son still to come, one in the line of David, leading us to Jacob's final son, the prophesied one, Benjamin. His life came from death. Son of the right hand, or son of strength. Rachel pronounced his name Ben-Oni, son of my sorrows. Christ, the ultimate son of prophecy, is the son of the right hand of the power of God. He came from the line of David. He came to die, to bring us new life from his death. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. God's purpose in allowing Israel to become a nation was so they could bring forth this God-man Messiah. Jesus, the Saviour of mankind, is the ultimate purpose for the nation Israel. Verse 25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service, which I have done for you. Notice, once Joseph is born, once his favoured wife has given him a son, Jacob seeks the blessings of Laban to leave and finally start his own life as his own master, no longer under another man's sway. But Laban never planned to willingly give Jacob up. He knew Jacob was his golden egg-laying goose. Verse 27. And Laban said to him, Please stay, if I have found favour in your eyes. For I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, Name me your wages, and I will give it. Now if Jacob had any sense, he would have known to check the fine print in any contract with Laban. But Jacob thinks he's learned enough now from the professor of prevarication, the master of manipulation, so Jacob will name his wages. Verse 29, So Jacob said to him, You know how I have served you, and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now, when shall I provide for my own house? Jacob needlessly explains to Laban his reasonable desire to provide a legacy for his own family. Verse 31. So he said, "What shall I give you?" Laban repeats, "What shall I give you? Name your wages." Laban didn't need an explanation. He was after a number. And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the lambs, will be considered stolen, if it is with me. You keep the pure breeds, and I'll take the mixed animals," is effectively the deal Jacob proposes. "You have all the good-looking animals, and I'll take the less good-looking spotted and speckled." Perhaps the spotted and speckled were considered culturally less desirable. But Jacob knew the truth. There was no difference in the quality of the meat, milk, wool, or skins. Verse 34. And Laban said, "Oh, that it were according to your word." So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Laban seems very happy with this deal, all but confirming the cultural preference for the light-skinned, even-coloured sheep and goats. Laban separates happily 3 days' journey apart his pure breed, uniform-looking flocks. Jacob is now a man well over 100 years of age, but he's very hands-on in his management and oversight of the flocks. And Jacob's next actions have caused a lot of controversy in Christian circles. Verse 37. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Again, due to an economy of words, we don't really know what's going on with these actions of Jacob. Are his actions in readying this combination of elaborately prepared vegetation having an impact on the DNA of the flocks? I don't think so. But does Jacob think it is? I very much doubt it. But even if he did, it would be similar to the earlier mandrakes, using superstition to achieve an outcome that God allows to come about for his greater purposes, in spite of the silly superstitions. But far more likely, Jacob is attracting the females with treats and then has his speckled bucks service the females whilst they ate. Verse 40. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face towards the street, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves, and did not put them with Laban's flocks. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Jacob engages in intentional selective breeding. He doesn't allow Laban's rams to mate with his speckled ewes, and ensures his speckled rams mate with Laban's ewes. His actions are not commendable. He's acting unfaithfully and unrighteously, and completely true to his natural carnal ways. He's stealing from Laban. He's attracting the stronger females with vegetation treats, and ensuring they're mated with his speckled, striped and brown rams. I believe Jacob is very familiar with animal husbandry and understands selective breeding. After closely observing for decades sheep and goats breeding, he knows skin markings are irrelevant to meat and milk production. He knows the offspring of speckled and streaked rams are far more likely to be speckled and streaked. Finally, he selectively breeds the choicest quality stronger animals also. Jacob's as crooked and dishonest as they come. We'll pick up in our next study at Genesis 31. Until then, may God richly bless you all.